welcome back to Freely Blooming with Kaylee. I wanted to chat about something that I have really learned this last year that I've really got into that got pretty big in 2020. You know, last year when the quarantines and the lockdowns started happening, people were running out and pulling everything from the shelves, buying everything they possibly could. One thing there was a shortage of was yeast, because people were making so much bread at home, which I think is really cool. I really wish everybody would stick with it, but homemade bread, there's just nothing like it. So sourdough got really, really big. And that's because sourdough is basically a fermenting process where you're creating wild yeast. You don't have to buy yeast. All it takes is really just flour and water in your sourdough starter. So I really wanted to chat about how to make a sourdough starter. Now, it's not the easiest thing you're ever gonna do. It does take some work, it does take some patience. But if you do it, and you do it well, and you do it correctly, it will turn into a starter. Now, I did have quite a few months and quite a few weeks of a really hard time with my starter. I had quite a rough time getting one going, and I really wish somebody would have been like, hey, that's not how you do it either. Now, as you probably know, we're under quite the winter storm here in Oklahoma currently right now. Tomorrow, when you see this, it'll still be that way. And it kind of breaks my heart a little bit that I don't have an oven, because really all I want is fresh bread and I can't bake. Hopefully it will get here on Thursday. So while I can't show you a really gorgeous freshly baked sourdough bread, I did just want to talk about a starter and how to get one going. You really just never know when you'll ever be in a position where you can't just go grab bread from the grocery store. So quite a few years ago, actually about 7 or 8 years ago, I did have a really good starter, and somehow it fizzled out. I don't know what happened. I tried to make another starter probably 4 or 5 different times over the years, and it just never really turned out, and I couldn't figure out why. And now there are so many good resources that tell you that, and I'm not going to tell you exactly like every single thing that could possibly go wrong, just because there are so many different websites that can tell you that. Again, littlespoonfarm.com is a really great resource as far as sourdough goes, but I did just want to kind of tell you the gist of it, what you need, kind of what the process takes in case you wanted to try making sourdough bread. Now, this isn't something that's incredibly hard. It's not the easiest thing you've ever done, but it's going to be simple. The process is simple. It just takes time and just takes some planning, because the whole entire idea of sourdough is that you're fermenting the grains to make it healthier. So I'm going to talk about my guy, that's 8-year-old Patch, who is kind of just having a time. He wants to go out and play in the snow for some reason. So sourdough bread, the reason that I got into it, because I really learned about how grains affect our body. It is not uncommon now to find, all of us, you even may have a gluten intolerance. We all know somebody that has some sort of grain sensitivity, some type of gluten intolerance right now. And it's not necessarily just because it's grains. People have eaten grains since the beginning of time, and it's something that has sustained mankind since God, created the earth. And so it's not necessarily the grains in and of themselves that are bad. It's because grains have become so hybridized and so changed that the grains of today are no longer the grains that used to be on the earth. So there's an ancient grain called einkorn that I absolutely love to bake with. When I'm not baking with sourdough, that's almost exclusively what I use. I bake with einkorn and spelt flour, which I really do love to bake with. But my preferred option is sourdough, because I absolutely love the flavor. It's so good. What does the fermentation process really entail, and what does it even do, and why do we even care about it? Basically, when you ferment wheat, it is a process that breaks it down. You can almost think of it as a pre-digestion. So grains, especially modern grains, are really, really hard on the gut system. basically it gets to the point of not being really digestible very much. That's why so many people have grain sensitivities and so many people have gut issues anyway, so that really kind of lends to that. Now, I'm not talking about people who have celiacs. That is a completely different thing. They cannot have gluten at all in any way, shape, or form, and if you have celiacs, you cannot do sourdough. But I am talking about people who have grain sensitivities. I have seen where quite a few people who have grain sensitivities or gluten sensitivities can digest sourdough. My daughter being one of them, especially when she was quite a bit younger. When she was 4, she was diagnosed with asthma. She was actually put into ICU because it had gotten really, really bad. And since then, we have treated it naturally and don't really have to turn to medicines very often because we do more preventative measures and more so in healing her gut rather than just trying to throw medicine at a symptom. I realized that grains and gluten in particular, really aggravated her asthma. And basically because it was causing inflammation in her body. And what is asthma? Asthma is inflammation of the lungs. So I took out everything that was causing inflammation. So pulling out really highly limiting sugar, limiting gluten. She did so great for quite a few years, but I did notice that when she did have sourdough, that it didn't really bother her. And that's because the grains are basically pre-digested. It makes it easier to digest. It doesn't cause inflammation like regular grain does. That fermenting process kind of unlocks the potential that these grains have. All the good things, all the vitamins and the minerals coming from, and even the proteins that are coming from these wheats are unlocked by this fermentation process. It's easier to digest, it's healthier for you, and it just tastes better. Now you can make sourdough. I have seen where people have made a gluten-free sourdough starter and gluten-free sourdough bread. That's not really anything I'm going to be talking about today because I don't have a lot of experience. I don't have any experience with making gluten-free sourdough things. We actually all can or do really well on sourdough. It's not like we're eating it all day, every day, but my kids do well on it. My daughter with asthma does well on it. We do well on it. So, I'm just gonna make traditional sourdough. Now I've seen where people use different flours to make sourdough. You can use almost any flour, really. You can use rye flour, just a regular bread flour, a regular all-purpose flour. Now I purchase my flour in bulk from Azure Standard. Now my last video was about Azure Standard, how much I've loved it. And one thing I really love about Azure Standard is that you can buy these giant 10-pound bags of flour. Now, if you're making your own sourdough bread, you're making a loaf every other day or every few days. I have found an awesome recipe for a soft sourdough sandwich bread in which I can make it and it lasts, kind of not a few weeks, longer than say like your artisan loaf. Like when people say sourdough, most of the time people are thinking of that really crusty, gorgeous, round artisan loaf, right? Which I absolutely love. I love making, you can make these gorgeous designs on top, which I haven't mastered yet, I'm getting there. But you can also make a really good soft sourdough bread. You can make so many different things. Really, you can make anything out of sourdough, anything baked. I've made sourdough blueberry muffins that taste absolutely amazing. I take the sourdough starter and mix it up at night, and it ferments all night, and then you make them in the morning. And same with pancakes and waffles and cinnamon rolls. Really, sourdough is just your wild yeast, and it's soaking all those grains, and it's making it more digestible and really healthier for you. Now, obviously, there is always a need for balance. It doesn't mean we're eating a loaf a day, but it does mean that we can eat bread a little bit more and feel a little bit better, our guts feel better, and we just do well on it. The types of flours that I buy from Azure Standard, now you can buy any sort of organic, non-GMO, white flour, bread flour, anything. I have typically seen, in my experience, I have done all bread flour or all-purpose flour, and I found that mixing the two is really just a preference for me. Everybody's gonna have their own opinion on flours and what they like to use. So I like to mix a bread flour, also a white all-purpose flour. Now these are from Azure Standard. What's awesome about Azure Standard is they also sell these in 25-pound bags, which is a lot of flour. But if you're making a lot of sourdough and you have a starter going and you're keeping it out, you're making all the things, you're actually gonna go through those pretty quickly. The basics of a starter. Now I just pulled this out of my fridge. I've been leaving it in my fridge to kind of keep it dormant. I don't really keep very much starter. I've seen where people have just loads and loads of starter, these big jars, and that's what I used to do. I used to think you had to keep all this starter and you had all this stuff, you just threw it away, which to me is super wasteful. You can use the discard, which is basically after you feed your starter, you're always gonna get rid of some. You can use that discard to also bake with. Basics of a starter, all you need is flour and water and clean jars. It really is that simple. You don't need a lot. Now, the one thing I am going to say is that with your flour, whatever you choose to use, I liked doing half all-purpose and half bread flour to make my starter, because bread flour is a higher protein content and I feel like it created that yeast a little bit faster. So you need a warm environment and a clean jar. When you very first start out, you're going to put equal parts of flour and water in a jar. It could be 20 grams each, it could be 15 grams each. Whatever you're gonna do, put equal amounts in a clean jar. And then you're going to not seal the jar, you're going to lightly cover it. Whether you wanna use plastic wrap, whether you wanna put a towel over with a rubber band around it to make sure nothing gets in the jar. And if you're doing this in the summer, maybe fruit flies, and flies are going to be an issue. I like to just take my mason jar lid and just easily set it on. So it's still getting, it's not just completely sealed in, right? You're going to mix that in a clean jar. You're going to let it sit for 24 hours. Basically what you're doing is letting that yeast ferment and let it start to activate. And then you're going to feed it. So now this is where I've found that a lot of places told me feed it 1-to-1. That means you have this, right? Maybe you pour 20 grams of this, okay? Now a kitchen scale, super important. I'm gonna stop right here. A kitchen scale is so important. I will put a link to the one I use, an Amazon link, because I think, you could definitely do this without one, but I feel like a kitchen scale has really kind of upped my sourdough game. It has helped me so much just because ratios are really important when you're doing sourdough. You wanna have equal ratios of flour to water, and when you're using a measuring cup, those are not going to be the same weight. When you have half a cup of water and half a cup of flour, those are not going to be the same weight. And they're not going to be as precise as using a kitchen scale. So if you don't have one, you can still definitely do it, but it is easier to do it with a kitchen scale. Now, say I have some starter, right? This is after my first day, okay? Let's just say this is my first day. This is my first mixture. I have 20 grams, or say a tablespoon or whatever. So you can take a tablespoon out, and you're going to at least double, if not triple it. So if you take 1 tablespoon out and you put it in a jar, right? Now what you have left in this jar is discard. That means it's done. It's not gonna be, your really active starter anymore that's gonna give you your rise and your bread or whatever. Don't throw it away. Look up on Pinterest or somewhere how to use sourdough discard. I'll talk about in a minute, there's thousands of recipes for discard. You can make discard pancakes, waffles, literally anything. There's no need to throw it away. Just to me, that's just super wasteful. When I'm using a discard recipe that's not fermenting all night, that's when I would use my spelt flour or my einkorn. Now you've taken a tablespoon out, right? And that's what you have. Put it in a new clean jar. And then you're going to double that. So 1 tablespoon, say if I had 1 tablespoon, or say 15 or 20 grams of starter in a new clean jar. Now I'm going to add, if I double that, I'm gonna do either 2 tablespoons of flour and 2 tablespoons of water, or say if you did 15 grams, okay? And you can take notes. I used to take lots of notes when I was watching YouTube videos about starter. You can take, 15 grams of your starter and make add 30 grams of flour and 30 grams of water, and then that's gonna be your new starter. You're gonna have it in the jar, you're gonna cover it, and then you're gonna let it sit for another 24 hours. And I am gonna be making something, so I'll show you in a little bit exactly how I mix all of this up on my kitchen scale, but it really is as simple as just stopping and thinking, okay, I need to take some out of this now. So after 24 hours, it's eaten all its food, it's ready to be fed. Now, if you are after 24 hours or even 12 hours, say if you fed it in the morning, if you get to the evening time where you're thinking, what is this nasty liquid on top? So if your starter ever gets a liquid on top, that is called hooch. Yeah, I don't know who makes these things up, but it's called hooch, which basically is just saying that hey, my starter is hungry. Instead of using more starter, really you need less starter and just more food. It needs more food, which flour and water is its food. That yeast is hungry. It wants to activate. It wants to do its thing for you. Just feed it some more, right? I see where people actually name their sourdough starters, which I totally need to name mine. I think it's just an appropriate thing. You know, it's a living organism. There's bacteria and all sorts of things living in here, like my kombucha SCOBY. Like I feel like it needs a name. It wants to be fed, right? Just think of it like a pet, you know, give it the attention that you would an actual pet, and you'll do pretty well with it. If you ever see that water on top, then that's kind of a sign that tells you maybe you need to feed it earlier or you need to feed it more, okay? So if you're getting a lot of good yeast buildup, maybe you need to start feeding it twice a day. And you're gonna find a lot of differing opinions on this. And I think it really just depends on your kitchen. It depends on the humidity in your home. It depends on the temperature of your home. Starting when it's really, really cold, like a snowpocalypse happening, a blizzard happening, and you're being told to, you know, limit your power and your electric use, maybe that's not the right time to make a sourdough starter, but you'll get there. Basically, just paying attention to your sourdough starter is going to be key. Like, what's it doing? What does it look like after you feed it? How long is it taking to double up? Now, if you have been having a starter in 3 or 4 days and it hasn't doubled in volume after you fed it before, that's perfectly fine. You will get there, I promise. There's so many different websites and things that show you how to troubleshoot your starter, but if you just hang in there, I promise you'll get it. And I wish somebody had told me that when I was trying to make my starter for about 4 months. Now, maybe say you've had this for a couple of days and you're thinking, can I make bread with this? Really what you want to look for is the fact that it's doubling in size. That's kind of telling you that, like, hey, I'm ready to make bread and I will do my job. So the starter is what's going to cause your rise in your bread. Your bread probably won't rise if you're not using the starter at its peak. That means it's going to double in size. Before it starts to fall back down, that's when you're going to use it. Pay attention. A lot of times I will take a rubber band and have it around the jar. That's a way of marking where it was when you mixed it up. And that way you can see when it actually doubles in size. I'll show you the difference between my cold starter that's been in my fridge. Basically, you can keep your starter like this when you're not ready to use it and you're thinking, I've made so much bread and so much sourdough this last week, I can't possibly make any more. Or if you're tired of it, if you're going out of town, the way to keep it alive is to stick it in your fridge. It kind of just makes it go dormant. It's slowly eating. You can feed it, stick it in there. As long as you're feeding it once a week, you're good to go in the fridge. Now here's the difference. Here's my starter that I fed earlier. Now, you don't see a whole lot of bubbles happening, right? That's just because it's cold, it's not activating super fast. And then this is the leaven I'm gonna be mixing up. I'll show you what I mixed up this morning. This is the leaven I'm gonna be making some dough tonight, but I fed it and it's already risen just a little bit. It's a little bit cold, so maybe sticking it by the fire to get it activated a little bit easier. But you can tell the difference between an active starter or an active leaven because of the bubbles. You'll see tons of bubbles and it'll have a really great texture. To me, I kind of nerd out in all this, and I think it's just it's a gorgeous living thing. So it's not totally activated yet. When it's completely activated, that's when you use it. You'll look inside, it'll be, really bubbly, it'll be stringy, it smells really yeasty, it has just a really kind of sweet, yeasty smell. It's kind of hard to describe until you start to smell it. Now, if you're here wanting to learn about how to make a starter, then surely you've looked at some sourdough recipes, right? So another reason why I like Little Spoon Farm, I know that I'm throwing their name out there a ton, but it's because they have a lot of their recipes, especially they're just like their country sourdough loaf is what they call it. If you want to make an artisan crunchy crust bread, you're going to be spending a little bit more time planning out the whole sourdough process. And it's kind of hard sometimes to get that timing right. Like, when do I need to feed it? When can I make my dough? Look at all these, different rising times and all this other stuff to making recipes. Now, if you start off by making, say, like banana bread with your sourdough starter, or pancakes or waffles, that's maybe a little bit of an easier step rather than jumping straight into bread. But I know if you're like me, you're like, I'm just gonna do it. I'm going all in, making the bread, doing all the things. That's how I am, and that's how I operate. Their recipe for their country sourdough loaf has all the timing out for you. Now it'll say, you know, take out your starter at 8 a.m., feed it, and by 6 p.m., whatever, it's ready to make a recipe. So I know that's kind of the cart before the horse. You really need a good starter before you get into that. But it is important to know that once you have your starter, it is going to take a little bit more planning. You can't just have your starter and have it out and have it great and good and make a loaf of bread that day. It is a process. It is a fermentation process, and that flour has to have time to ferment and to sit and to rise. It's not like packaged, manufactured yeast where you pour it in, you see the rise and it happens. Sourdough is a longer process, and I think, not only does it taste better, but there's going to be more satisfaction coming out of that loaf of bread because you spent more time and a little bit more of a process getting it. So once you have your starter all ready to go, ready to make all the yummy things, I am right now mixing up basically what you call a leaven. So the leaven is essentially your starter that you have activated and mixed up, ready to go for any sort of recipe. Most sourdough recipes that you're going to look at and you're going to find will have, they will call for a certain amount of sourdough starter. So this recipe I'm using calls for half a cup of sourdough starter, or I think it was 50 grams or something like that. What I'm gonna do, so I took only 15 grams for this specific recipe. It actually gave me the amounts I needed exactly to make my starter that I'm going to use in my recipe. Now, sourdough does take a lot of planning ahead. It's not hard. It's just getting used to doing things in advance and doing things super, like I have talked about. My oven has been out I've been without an oven for probably a month and a half. I was without it for a while, got fixed, and ended up not being able to be resolved. And so I'm waiting on a new oven. So I haven't been able to bake any bread or anything for over a month. That's been super sad. I mean, right now we're in the middle of like snow apocalypse, basically, like most of the country is in, but here in the South in Oklahoma, these temperatures are not normal. And all I want is some warm, fresh baked bread, and it's just not possible right now, which is super sad. So I thought, is there absolutely anything other than pancakes, waffles, things I cook in my, my skillet? Is there anything I can make for tomorrow? My kids are just like dying to have like muffins and things again, but is there anything I can make that doesn't require an oven? And then it hit me, oh my goodness, I can make English muffins. And I've been wanting to make English muffins so bad. So this specific recipe gave me the exact instructions for making my leaven. So this is my starter. Because of the fact that I haven't been able to bake any bread, I have kept this in the fridge. Now, keeping it in the fridge keeps it dormant. So I just take it out, I warmed it up, I fed it. And now I have some active starter that I fed yesterday. It's ready to be fed again. This recipe calls for 15 grams of starter. So I just weighed out 15 grams, and then I'm going to add 50 grams of flour and 50 grams of water to this. And then that mixture is actually what I'm going to use in my recipe. So this is gonna sit all day. It's gonna get nice and active and bubbly, and it's gonna be really ready for me to mix the dough tonight. So yes, it is technically a 24-hour process. So I'm mixing this up. I'm gonna mix up the dough tonight, which you'll probably see. And then in the morning, I'm going to make my English muffins. So there's still a little bit of a process to go, but each step isn't necessarily hard. It just takes a little bit of time, a little bit of planning. Now I have my leaven all ready to go for my English muffin recipe. Really excited to try these. It's the first time I've ever made them. So this is the difference between your leaven and your starter. This is a starter that you literally never throw away. You always at least keep 10 to 15 grams out of your starter to refresh and have more and have it ready to go. But it's easier to keep a small starter like this and only use very small amounts, and then make your leaven instead of having huge jars of starter and then, you know, accidentally, maybe you have a recipe that calls for 300 grams of starter and you only have 250 in your whole entire thing, and you're ready to make bread and you've got all the stuff out, and now you don't have enough starter and you're afraid to use it all. You cannot use all your starter. Your starter's gone. You're gonna have to start off, you know, from scratch at step one. My starter I'm going to keep. Now I'm going to feed this again. I don't want to feed it a ton. Keep 10 or 15 grams out of this and feed it. And that's what I'm going to keep as my starter, that I can take the rest of this and put it in a jar and keep it in the fridge. So I'll have a jar of starter and a jar of discard. And I can just keep adding to that discard until I have enough to make a recipe. So there's tons of, you know, different recipes too for discard. You can search on Pinterest and find literally hundreds of discard recipes. One of my favorites has been sourdough crackers. Again, I can't bake right now in my oven, but I can use the discard and mix up a really cool, I'll add Parmesan to it, a little bit of rosemary. They're absolutely delicious, and it doesn't hardly take any time. You mix it up and you roll it out and you bake it for a little while. It's actually wonderful. So I'm gonna keep my starter, so I'll have more later. But this is my leaven. I'm gonna take my leaven, I'm gonna gently cover it. I don't wanna seal it in, but I'm gonna cover this. And again, my house is really cold right now, so it may take a little bit longer. It'll probably be a little bit later into the evening or the night before I actually mix up my English muffin dough. And it's going to ferment all night long. It's gonna have that really awesome sourdough flavor to the dough mixture because it's gonna ferment all night long. I used all-purpose flour for this one, and I will use all-purpose flour. I'm gonna cover this. I'm gonna set it on my counter and I'll show you how it does grow. So this is how much I have right now. It should double in size, which again, it's cold, so I'm crossing fingers. It should double in size, and by the time it does that, that's when I'm gonna mix my dough. Now, just to recap, a few tips on your starter. Don't ever close the lid very tightly. It needs to have air and it needs to have circulation. Always feed double the amount of starter that you're using. Don't keep it in direct sunlight because the heat and the light can actually kill the yeast and the bacteria that are forming. Some flours that may not be as best as far as activating a starter. Some flours, say like spelt, you can definitely cook with after you have an active sourdough starter, but they may not be the best at making a starter because they have a lower gluten content. So you're not gonna get a lot of that yeast buildup. It's gonna take a really, really long time. Although I don't have experience with this, I've heard that rye flour, because of the gluten and the protein content, rye flour is actually the best to make a starter with. Although I don't have experience with it, so I didn't really wanna talk about it. Although I have rye flour, haven't quite cooked with it yet. But what has worked for me has been bread flour and all-purpose flour. Always feed into a clean jar. And when I feed, that means taking your starter, mixing in flour and water. Biggest tip I can give you is do not give up. I know this can be a lengthy process. I've had friends who've had a really great starter in a week to 2 weeks. It took me probably a couple of months, but you can do it. I promise if you take the time to have a really good starter, you're gonna have, you're gonna have some flops, but you're going to have some wins. And with sourdough, it's been my experience that it really just takes experimenting with it and really doing it. It's not something that you can watch somebody do a few times and think, I'm an expert, I can totally do this. Even after months of feeling like I had this down, I took a class from Ashley Turner. You can find her on Instagram at Turner Farm. She is amazing. Her stories are fantastic. She has saved highlights and everything on Instagram as far as her whole entire sourdough process, and she's done it for so many years, and she has so many great tips. I paid for a live Zoom class online, and I'm even using her notes now, but I took so many notes. I've learned so much from her. So there's definitely experts that are better at this than me, But I just wanted to encourage you that it's not hard to get a sourdough starter going. It just takes time and a little bit of patience.